Hi, and welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of everything public policy, politics. It's been a crazy week. I'm so glad you're here. We're going to break everything down that's been happening over the last week, particularly when it comes to the state budget. Okay, this week on the Debrief, we have our whole Carolina Journal team here. Super excited about that. Alex Baltziger has been covering the state legislature and, of course, the state budget. We have opinion editor David Larson joining us here, and then we have Teresa Opeka, who covers the executive branch for Carolina Journal, and then, of course, all things education coming from Carolina Journal's David Bass. All right, we're going to jump right in. It's been a really tumultuous week. I know you've probably been following it. It all started last weekend. A lot of back and forth going on in the Republican Caucus, negotiations over the state budget, casinos, Medicaid expansion, you name it. Finally, there was a big announcement on Tuesday evening. They'd reached a deal. Alex, bring us up to date. What happened?
Yeah, so a lot has happened since last week. I honestly can't even remember what my update was last week, but there was this package where there were going to be casinos and they were going to tie it to Medicaid expansion outside of the budget. That sort of fell through because most Democrats, if not all of them, came out against that concept, and there were already enough House Republicans that were against it to where they were going to need that to make it work. Sure. And so the numbers just weren't there on the House side. And so Berger kind of decided, we're just not going to do it this session. Mm-hmm. He said, maybe they'll go back to it down the road,
sure.
maybe next session,
yeah,
maybe later.
Yeah, emotions are running high.
Emotions were high. I think he was right about that, but that's definitely where he placed the blame was on people's emotions
sure.
rather than their intellect.
Right.
By it, you mean casinos, right?
Yeah.
Casinos, yeah, and VLTs, and I
sure.
think he even mentioned, I think he said at least Cooper had VLTs in his proposed budget. I haven't looked into that, but
video lottery terminals.
Yes, video
right.
lottery terminals.
Okay.
So anyways, there was a lot of debate. Casinos were, hotly debated.
Sure.
And that was within the Republican caucus, within the Democrat caucus. Lots of controversy there. But anyways, long story short, we did not end up with casinos.
Okay.
We ended up with no casinos. Medicaid expansion still in the budget. That was almost always going to be the case.
Okay.
They could have gotten caught up in something, but Medicaid expansion's in there. Basically, the House and Senate reached a compromise finally over months of deliberation. They finally got to an agreement. Some of the big headline pieces of this, school choice might be the biggest thing in this. They have expanded the Opportunity Scholarship
sure.
universally, so it doesn't matter your income level in terms of whether you are eligible to receive it.
Sure.
But it does sort of have a progressive scale there. $1.2 billion in tax cuts. Some of this is potential tax cuts depending on revenue triggers, and the personal income tax is the biggest thing they're looking at cutting. But North Carolina is going to need to meet certain revenue triggers to get those cuts done.
Okay.
There's a number of other tax cuts. The franchise tax has been capped. Privilege tax has been repealed. Another big ticket item, NC Innovation, which has been talked about for a while now, and the Senate originally proposed a $1.425 billion endowment for NC Innovation.
Okay.
That has been scaled back significantly to probably $500 million.
Okay.
But they have to meet certain thresholds and requirements to get the second part of the $250 million next year. Some other big ticket items that I don't think have been talked about too much is $2 billion for water and sewer projects. There are about 200 projects in the budget that received a significant amount of money. That's been a problem that's been talked about at the local level a lot, but not something that's talked about a lot in the news. And then this is kind of an interesting tidbit for probably some segment of our audience. Lobbyists will now be able to receive fast passes to get into the building and skip the security line, but they're going to have to pay $2,000 for it.
$2,000.
$2,000 for it.
Wow.
And liaisons, so other government agency liaisons, are going to be able to pay $1,000 to get the same fast pass.
Right.
So that was interesting. Lobbyist fees are also going up from $250 a year to
sure.
$500 a year.
Wow. Interesting. So we're like probably one of the highest in the country for that, right?
Probably.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at that too
sure.
much, but I know in the Southeast, I think Donald Bryson put out a
Sure.
chart with showing some of the other states. Some are zero, some are like $100, something like that.
Sure.
There wasn't a lot
500
of
is-
sympathy, though, for
Yeah.
the lobbyists.
Oh, there's
I didn't
no-
see anybody crying for the
Yeah,
lobbyists.
people weren't that upset. Oh, their fees went up a little bit.
There's no sympathy for the lobbyists, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But another thing I don't think I mentioned yet is the state employee and teacher pay
Okay.
raises. This was something that a lot of people were looking at, but that ended up being around 7% for most state employees and teachers.
Sure.
I believe they did a larger raise for entry-level teachers to
Okay.
sort of bring, as an incentive, to bring more teachers in than they did for more senior teachers. And then bus drivers, this one was interesting. We've had a major bus driver shortage,
Sure.
and that showed up in the budget. They're giving them a 9% raise over the 2 years. So they added sort of an extra 2% on top of the average state employee.
Sure.
raise.
Very interesting. What are you watching? There's been a few little nuggets
Yeah.
here and there showing up.
I think, as we're all
Sure.
journalists here, and whether you're a journalist on the left or the right, I think, and also for grassroots groups and all that, they
Sure.
took notice of some language on public records that in the past legislators would give their records to the the Department of Archives.
Sure.
And they would determine kind of what's a public record and what's not. And there was some language in there that says now that the legislators will determine for themselves what to give to the Archives Department. So WRL's Travis Payne, I believe, he called around to the people in the Budget Committee, the Appropriations Committee chairs, and said, where did this come from? What was the purpose of that? And they said that was from leadership, just kind of that language. And so
Sure.
it's an interesting element, because we often have public records requests, and
Oh gosh, yes.
and we'll want to know certain things. So if a legislator decides not to give us a certain record, it's embarrassing. They just don't want to. They can not only not give it to us, but then they can get rid of it and decide it's not. There's not a lot of checking behind the scenes to see
Sure.
was this or was this not something that should be a public record. So we'll see how that goes and exactly the implications of that. But I know
This is a big deal.
Yeah.
It really is. Phil Lucy over at the North Carolina Association of North Carolina Press Association put out an all-call. So did the North Carolina Broadcasting Group. They put out an all-call and said, contact your senator and say, this is not transparency. We are, we're part of the public. We provide information to the public. This gives lawmakers, legislative branch custodians, they're custodians of their own record. So they don't have somebody who's making that decision for them. In most cases, they're custodians of their own record, and they get to decide what's public record and what's not. And that's how it appears to be in this legislation. They can say, I'll destroy this record and not that record. So the idea of having someone making that decision about their own records is alarming from a journalistic standpoint, but also really should be from a public standpoint. Teresa, you and I have worked on a lot of public records requests, and they don't get very far.
No, they don't. They don't. It's
Right.
like keeping secretive about everything. But no matter what side you're on, left, right, public, yeah,
Sure.
it is very concerning that they would even propose legislation
It is.
like that.
It is concerning. We were talking about the budget and education. David, you've been following this really closely. Opportunity scholarships basically becomes universal school choice if everybody has access to it. But Cooper has said no. Do you think this will be the poison pill in the budget for him?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, whenever Cooper has previously talked about the budget, he always, the top couple of things he mentions, usually the school vouchers are part of that. So definitely it's one of the top things he opposes. And as Alex mentioned, essentially what this does is previously the Opportunity Scholarship Program, which is meant to enable families to attend a private school if that's their choice. Previously, that was only available to kind of moderate and lower income North Carolinians. So with this, it expands it to all income levels and a tiered system. So the lower income would still be prioritized first. And then if you get further up the income scale, if all those incomes are filled, then it would be available for higher incomes. There's been a lot of messaging out there about how this is school vouchers for millionaires. I'll be very interested to see how many millionaires actually take advantage of it. The vast majority of families, I would say, 90-95% are moderate and lower income families that otherwise would really have a hard time affording the tuition, but they want an alternative to their public school. So this is basically just enabling them to have that opportunity.
Sure, because there is a finite amount of money in the fund itself.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, the funding's being increased. I'm sure the demand for it is going to go up. But yeah, there is a finite amount of money. So again, the lower incomes would be prioritized first,
Right,
those
and
families.
in the budget, it doesn't appear to be, Opportunity Scholarships isn't being funded out of the slice that's for public education, correct? It's a separate item?
Right. Yeah. And to that point, I mean, there's this there's this Twitter kind of thread about how this is an effort to dismantle public education in North Carolina and all this sort of thing. So spending on public education is actually going up, of course, in this budget. It's going up 6% in the new fiscal year, and then the following fiscal year it would be going up about 10%. So if this is an effort to dismantle public education, it's a weird way of going about it.
Sure.
And to
Well,
that
don't for-
point, the per pupil spending calculation, so wealthier or middle class kids are not going to receive the full per pupil allotment, and in the budget it says that all savings, the intent of those savings are supposed to go back into the public schools, and so public schools are actually going to benefit in terms of funding from this budget.
Sure.
Yeah.
What were you guys
I was going to say, don't forget we're still under an education state of emergency,
Oh,
according
right.
to Roy Cooper. So I
Yes.
mean, this still continues
Very.
under that banner. It's still up on his website.
It is still up there. That's right.
So-
And actually, I'm coming back to you. There was a funny exchange. We're talking about messaging and behind the scenes and what's going on. You had this hilarious Twitter exchange going on this week. Rob, see if you can get that up there because that was pretty good.
So yeah, for context here, there was a letter about, as I mentioned earlier, the Democrats did not like the deal that Republicans were proposing, at least leadership was proposing in terms of packing casinos with Medicaid expansion. Terrence Everett, who's a House member, had, if you wouldn't mind going back to that first slide there, he had put out a tweet calling out one of his Democratic colleagues in the Senate, Senator Paul Lowe, for not signing on immediately. It was like, it was not too long afterwards, and Lowe had not quite signed on to this thing yet,
the very first one.
But it was very quick for Representative Everett to jump on him, and not only that, but he tagged the Forsyth County Democrats, which is Lowe's home county. So basically, the implication is he's like calling for a primary, just about.
Right.
And then the North Carolina Senate Democrats obviously put up an update like, okay, this letter is now signed by everyone. Everett deletes the tweet. And then, so that's the context there. And then Senator Lowe, his office is nearby Representative Everett's office. They're not that far from each other. And they had come back in for, what was that, Wednesday?
Yeah.
Lowe walks over to Everett's office after already talking with his LA.
Sure.
And he's saying, "Where's Representative Terrence?" Which is obviously his first name.
Right.
And he's looking for him, and he goes into the office, and Everett had been in his office. Then he went to his LA's office, closed the door. Lowe knocks on the door. Everett doesn't answer, and Lowe ends up just going into the office. And Everett's just like sitting there at the desk, and I didn't hear what was said to him, but Lowe was not very pleased, and he kind of berated him for at least a minute.
Sure. Well, social media becomes the soapbox, right? They see what's going on, even though the guy's sitting next door to them.
That's right. I'd heard from the speaker's staff they had seen the whole interaction go down too, because they're like right above that on the second floor. So I think a lot of people witnessed this interaction there. It was pretty funny.
I mean, tempers are high.
Tempers are high.
The anxiety is high. Everybody's got something really invested in this budget.
I think people had forgotten that even amongst Democrats, there's been plenty of disagreements on how to approach things and how to handle messaging and stuff like that. And this sort of brought that to light a little bit, because obviously the narrative had been pinned on the Republicans for a while since they're the ones in charge.
Very interesting. All right. So, Teresa, tell me what you're watching in this budget.
Yeah, so before I get to that, one side note too about the casinos, I did hear something last night, an interesting report. Rockingham County Commissioners, where Phil Berger's from, they want no part of the casinos. Nobody in his home area wanted a part of that.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's very interesting. Another poll came out today that said, this actually could hurt him coming up in the spring. So let's stay tuned to that.
Wow.
But I found that very interesting that even his home district did not want any part.
I didn't realize that because the county commissioners voted to allow the rezoning of the area where they thought it might go.
Yeah, so I heard differently last night. So who knows? But
Yeah,
very interesting.
That one was interesting, and there might be, somebody who wants to primary Senator Berger.
Right.
And it might have even opened the door for that, but it should probably be noted that was public policy polling, and they were polling. They're a Democrat-leaning pollster
Right.
Okay.
exclusively, and they were polling Republican primary voters. So I don't know how much I trust them on polling Republican primary voters, but it
right.
was.
But it's interesting to see how much he wanted to, as they say, die on the hill
Yeah.
for something like that.
Right. So tell me what you're watching in the budget.
So we looked at the judicial system changing
Okay.
in the budget. Some notable things: it's $2.7 million to help implement North Carolina's voter ID law. That was
Okay.
one thing that came up.
Okay.
Also, raising the mandatory retirement age for appellate judges from 72 to 76.
Okay.
There's been some speculation that might help Paul Newby.
Right.
Because when his term ends, he would turn 73. So
Okay.
that's where they're taking a look at that.
Right.
Also, new assistant DAs would be included in the
Okay.
budget, and the SBI received some increased independence. Also, Supreme Court justices and Court of Appeal justices would have a right to have concealed carry. They'd
Okay.
be able to carry, guns into the courtroom.
Wow.
That drew the ire of, I believe it was Marcia Mori, Representative Marcia Mori on Twitter this week.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Had that in the article.
Would they be spinning guns? behind
Yeah,
the bench and all
twirling
that?
guns, stuff like that.
Right.
Right. Also, too, you would lose the right to appeal to the Supreme Court if there was dissent at the Court of Appeals level.
If there was even one dissent,
That's what it looked like.
you couldn't appeal.
Right.
Oh, interesting.
Right. Right.
Okay.
And one other thing was there was the appointments from it was the court. I'm losing my train of thought.
Sure.
Judicial Standards Commission.
Oh, yes.
4 appointments would go from the state bar to the legislature. So
Okay.
that's also been controversial as well.
Right, and there's been that conflict going on with Anita Earls.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Anything else that's caught your attention, David?
I mean, just kind of quickly back to the education
Of course,
front.
yeah.
It's interesting. There are raises in there for teachers. I think an average of 7% across the board, and then 11% as well for
Okay.
new teachers, because there's a huge effort, of course, to
Sure.
recruit. With the teacher shortage, bringing kind of the average salary up to about the $60,000 a year
Wow.
range, which is really kind of the median
Okay.
for the state. Across the state, that's about average. So there have been a lot of criticism surrounding that the teacher pay issue, the lack of personnel in schools and that sort of thing. So I think effort's been made in this budget to kind of address some of that. So
Sure.
a lot of the emphasis has been put, I think you can see some of the other items on there too, just with, some subsidies for breakfast and lunch for students, some safety grants, bus driver raises. So there's a lot of emphasis, I think, on the voucher part of it, the
Okay.
school choice part of it. But again, there's a lot of additional spending on public schools.
Sure.
And there are a lot of additional line items in there to kind of boost public schools. So it's putting a dent in that whole narrative that the Republican leadership is only focused on the private schools and the
Right.
vouchers. There's also a lot of investment in public education still.
Sure. The teacher shortage that you just mentioned, do you feel like that's it's been difficult, of course. A lot of people are experiencing teacher shortages. But is North Carolina really deep in teacher shortages? I feel like a lot of them is retirements. People are retiring. The workforce is aging in general. Teachers are not. But recruiting has been tough. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's an issue across the labor force right now,
Sure.
of course. And, the teaching profession, it's a tough job.
It's easy.
It
It's not
and
easy.
It's not easy. And also, of course, coming out of COVID, that was one of the
Right.
professions that was significantly impacted. So I do think you had a lot of folks who were, burned out from that.
Mm-hmm.
It's an ongoing issue to recruit the teachers. I do find it interesting, though. There are these private schools across the states, even charter schools. I find a lot of the teachers, even in my own experience in the private schools, they're paid less.
Sure.
They love being there.
Right.
They love being in an environment like that. And so I think it's interesting to examine why that's the case.
Right.
I think it's local control, it's empowerment. They're choosing to really want to be there to teach what they're teaching instead of with the public schools, the more bureaucratic kind of system there. So
Right.
maybe that's part of it. It's not all just about the pay, it's also about the environment.
Yeah, your quality of life and your everyday work, and the narrative can't be helping the narrative that they're getting, about the low pay and bad work environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, anything else you're watching on the budget? Yeah, we'll be paying attention to votes happening this week. But David Larson, we're going to switch gears a little bit. Things have gone on other than the budget this week, and another bill about fentanyl.
Yeah. So most of the attention has been on the budget,
Sure.
but there are other bills going through. So I did notice Senate Bill 189. It had passed much earlier out of the Senate. It was a bill Senators McGinnis, Britt, and Lazara had passed it, and they were the primary sponsors. I mean, and it passed out of the Senate, and then the House just passed it as well this week. Today it goes to the governor's office to see if he'll sign it or not. But basically, the bill increases both fines and penalties for fentanyl. So for possession of higher amounts, it goes up to $1 million fine.
Okay.
It had been $500,000 fine. So they drastically increased fines, as well as death by distribution, which is a law from a couple years back that they had, but they modified that too to make that stricter, which means if you are a drug dealer who sells somebody fentanyl and then the person dies,
Right.
you have a pretty strict, a pretty harsh penalty for that, almost like a homicide for
Sure.
leading to somebody's death for selling them fentanyl. And also the bill allowed for a task force to be created to look at law enforcement across the state, how best to deal with that. So I took notice of that because, I mean, it is an issue that it's really important to a lot of people who've lost loved ones. Now we're up to 100,000 people a year dying. It had been in the 90s when drug overdose deaths reached 10,000 people. It was a big deal with the heroin epidemic of the late 90s.
Sure.
But now it's 100,000, it's 10 times more.
Right.
So it's something that people are trying to figure out how to address. And I did notice that this harm reduction, these different organizations that favor something called harm reduction did not like the bill. They came out harshly against it. So including the North Carolina Council of Churches, which is now pretty far left kind of activist group.
Okay.
Almost. A lot of the mainline Protestant denominations are part of it and have kind of shifted to a lot of sort of activism, but they didn't like this bill because they said if you crack down too hard on drug dealers, you pull them off the street, new drug dealers come in, and that actually they link to a study from NC State that shows that will cause more drug overdose deaths because somebody moves in with a different potency of drug. And so they had a variety of arguments against the war on drugs and
Right.
why this would hurt. But I guess in the big
understand that
picture,
reason.
harm reduction
Yeah.
is things like what they would prefer, things like needles, free needles that would
Sure.
keep disease away. They have a lot of programs that they would prefer that seem to take a less harsh stance, just let people kind of use the drug in a safe way and rather than crack down on it. So there are kind of a couple different camps there, and it's just interesting to see them battle about what's the right way to go forward on dealing with
Sure.
pretty serious. I think it's the #1 cause of death of adults under 50 or so.
Wow.
Is drug overdose deaths. So.
Sure.
I think it's
Yeah.
interesting with the perception, though, of like using a drug in a safe way, because with fentanyl,
Right.
you can so quickly overdose on it. It's not like the drugs of yesteryear,
No,
with that. So
It's a
I wonder
failed
how
policy. Yeah.
they would react to that, where such a small amount, depending on the potency, it can, kill you very easily.
They wanted to try that in Philadelphia, open up a center
exactly
doing
what
that. But all
yeah.
you have to do is take a look at Kensington up in Philadelphia, where they're all on the streets, humped, laying over on the side or hanging over right now. Philadelphia's got a huge drug problem. So I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't think
Yeah.
that's a good point to bring.
It seems
I mean,
like
good
failed
for you to bring
policy.
up, but
Yeah.
yeah, bad policy.
Yeah, I
Right.
think that's if you look at where it's interesting. The harm reduction people always call their programs evidence-based.
Right.
But you look at what places are the places that have fully implemented all of their ideas. It's places like San Francisco, Seattle, Philadelphia.
Right.
Who they take all the harm reduction things, put them into place. Have safe injection sites. You have needles. You have all this stuff. And I mean, it looks like with the spiking of drug deaths in those cities and across the country, they're kind of the mainstream now. Like Josh Stein has put together a memorandum of agreement with all the counties to spend our $1.5 billion that we got from the opioid epidemic from the drug
Settlement.
companies,
Right.
the settlements, and a lot of the stuff in that agreement is harm reduction type stuff. I feel like they're kind of doing more harm than good, really, in a lot of what they're advocating for. But yeah, they don't like this the more, I guess, Republican approach on this to kind of crack down on the drugs.
Right.
So.
Right.
Enforce the law. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, tell me what your thoughts are. What are you hearing down at the legislature?
I may be remembering this incorrectly, but I believe in the budget there was a section spending at least a portion of that opioid settlement, and I don't remember what they were spending on. I just remember reading through this 600-something page document.
Yeah,
Well, they
of
get to
course.
spend 15%, like the memorandum of agreement gives 85%, I believe, to the counties, and the other
Okay.
15% the state gets to
Okay,
spend.
that makes
So
sense.
they
'Cause I
do
didn't
get to
remember it being
spend
a
part of it.
$1.5 billion
Right.
line item,
Right.
but yeah.
Mostly
that
for the
makes sense.
counties.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm alarmed to hear that the Attorney General would be pursuing these harm reduction type strategies with money that should be spent. I think, should be spent by the legislature first, but if he's going to have a portion of it, these harm reduction strategies really need to be studied more because we're seeing evidence-based, and that evidence looks like San Francisco and Philadelphia.
Yeah, and they discount faith-based and abstinence-based ones.
Sure.
They trash those and say don't give any money to them. Like a place like Trosa on Durham,
Right.
they have an abstinence-based, meaning they don't give you opioids like methadone and naloxone,
Sure.
or what's the other one? I don't know. There's different opioid treatments they'll give you, and they don't like that approach. They think it's unrealistic. But I spoke to the Trosa's president or director, and he was saying they have over 90% success rate. If you keep them in their program, it's a inpatient thing, so they don't leave
Sure.
2 years in there. They're over 90% success rate. So
Wow.
to say that they
That's
have no evidence,
Yeah.
if you keep people away from drugs and you teach them a new way of life, I mean,
Very
that seems like the least harm that could come to them is for them to leave drugs behind entirely. But
Sure. Very interesting. All right, I hope you're going to be writing on that.
I am.
All
yeah.
right, good.
I'm right on
Good.
that.
All
Well,
right,
you can tell I have
looking forward to
opinions
it.
on that. As the
Yeah.
opinion guy.
I can see that. Good. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Lots going on. We actually have a lot going on next week, too. We'll be talking about redistricting, probably, hearings starting up. People will be talking about that down at the legislature. So stick around. Make sure you like and subscribe. And we'll be coming right back to you next week. Thanks so much.